Dr. Claire Ellis sat in her sterile, dimly lit office, the walls lined with certificates and awards that testified to her years of medical expertise. But today, none of that seemed to matter. A tense silence filled the room as she stared at the 2 sheets of paper in front of her, each with the results of a DNA test. She had reviewed them countless times, hoping that her eyes were deceiving her, that the numbers were somehow wrong. But the truth was undeniable. The twins, identical in every way, at least, that's what they appeared to be, had somehow produced DNA results that made no sense. They had been born in the same hospital, on the same day, to the same parents. They had grown up together, sharing everything from their childhood memories to their school assignments. And yet, their DNA results didn't match. Not in the way they should. Dr. Ellis had worked in genetics for years, having seen many curious cases in her career, but nothing had prepared her for this. As she glanced down again at the test results, she felt a sense of dread crawling up her spine. The twins' genetic makeup was entirely different. Not just a few minor discrepancies, but a complete anomaly. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was just past midnight, and the quiet of the night seemed to weigh heavier as each second passed. Her fingers trembled slightly as she picked up the phone and dialed the number she knew she had to call. She had hesitated at first, unsure of what to say or how to explain it, but now there was no choice. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. 911, what's your emergency? This is Dr. Claire Ellis. I'm a geneticist, she said, her voice shaking but firm. I need immediate assistance. There's been a serious mix-up. I don't know how to explain it, but it's urgent. Please, send someone over right away. Dr. Ellis, the dispatcher's voice was calm but concerned. What's going on? I have twins here, Dr. Ellis continued, her heart racing as the words left her mouth. Identical twins. Their DNA it's not what we thought. They're not related. Not in any way. I need backup. Immediately. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Dr. Ellis could hear the dispatcher's breath hitch slightly. Are you sure, doctor? The dispatcher asked carefully, as though trying to comprehend the gravity of the situation. We'll send a team right away. Just stay with me. Please hurry, Dr. Ellis said, feeling the tension in her chest building with every passing second. I'm not sure what we're dealing with here, but this could be bigger than anything I've ever seen. With the call disconnected, Dr. Ellis leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that something far deeper was at play. This wasn't just a simple mistake or a lab error. There had to be something more to it. She couldn't imagine what, but she could feel the weight of the unknown pressing against her chest. What could possibly cause 2 genetically identical people to have completely unrelated DNA? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sharp knock at the door. Dr. Ellis? A voice called from the other side. She quickly stood and crossed the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She opened the door to reveal Detective Lisa Turner, her face stern and serious, but also carrying an air of disbelief. Dr. Ellis had worked with law enforcement in the past, but she had never seen Turner look so unsettled. Detective Turner, Dr. Ellis said, her voice steady but tinged with concern. Thank you for coming so quickly. Turner stepped inside, glancing at the test results that Dr. Ellis had spread out on her desk. She didn't even need to look closely to see the confusion written all over them. You weren't exaggerating, Turner said softly. This doesn't make any sense. No, it doesn't, Dr. Ellis replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I've been in this business for over 20 years, and I've never encountered something like this. Turner's brow furrowed as she took a seat across from Dr. Ellis. Are you telling me these twins, who look identical in every way, are not genetically related at all? Dr. Ellis nodded grimly. That's exactly what I'm saying. I don't know how it's possible, but the data doesn't lie. This is It's unbelievable, Turner murmured, as if trying to process what she was hearing. I need to speak with the twins. Where are they? They're in the examination room, Dr. Ellis replied. They've been waiting. Turner stood up, her gaze hardening with determination. We need to get to the bottom of this. Now. As the two women walked down the sterile hallway toward the examination room, Dr. Ellis felt her anxiety mount. Every step seemed to echo in the empty hall, each sound amplifying her unease. What was going on here? How could two people who had grown up as siblings, shared every experience, every moment, be genetically unrelated? The door to the examination room was ajar, and Dr. Ellis pushed it open. The twins were sitting on a bench, side by side, looking entirely ordinary, two young adults, no older than 20. They were dressed casually, their hair neatly styled, but their faces betrayed nothing. They had the look of people who had been told something they couldn't quite believe, but had no choice but to accept. Hello, Dr. Ellis began, trying to sound as calm as possible. I'm Dr. Claire Ellis, and this is Detective Turner. We need to talk to you about something very important. The twins nodded, their expressions unreadable. Is it true? One of them, a young man with short cropped hair, asked quietly. Are we really not related? Dr. Ellis felt a pang of sympathy. She could see the confusion in their eyes, the fear that came from being told something that didn't make sense. We need to ask you some questions, Turner said, her voice gentle but firm. Can you tell us about your parents? What do you know about them? The twins exchanged a glance, a flicker of something. Was it doubt, crossing their faces? We've always known we were adopted, the young woman spoke up, her voice trembling slightly. But we were told we were adopted together. That we were placed in the same family. Is that not true? Detective Turner leaned forward, her expression softening. What about your biological parents? Do you know anything about them? The twins hesitated, their faces a mirror of uncertainty. We don't know anything about them, the young man replied. We've only ever known about the family we grew up with. They were good to us. We've always thought of them as our real parents. Dr. Ellis felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She didn't know what to say. The information she had wasn't adding up with what the twins were telling her. There had to be more to the story. But what? This doesn't make sense, Dr. Ellis muttered, her mind racing. You were adopted, but the DNA test says, you're not related at all. Not even by blood. The twins' eyes widened in shock. They exchanged another glance, this one filled with disbelief. How is that possible? The young woman whispered. I don't know, Dr. Ellis admitted. But we need to find out. There's something more here, something deeper. I don't know what it is yet, but we'll get to the bottom of this. Detective Turner stood, her eyes narrowing. We'll start by looking into your adoption records. But there's something here that's bigger than any of us realize. And we're going to find it. As the twins sat in silence, the gravity of the situation weighed heavily in the room. What was the truth? Who were these twins really? And what secret had been hidden from them all these years? Dr. Ellis turned toward the door, her mind already spinning with the possibilities. This wasn't just a mistake. This was something far bigger, something that would change everything they thought they knew about their lives. And as she left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Something far more dangerous was lurking, and the truth was far darker than anyone could have imagined. Detective Lisa Turner stood in the hallway, her mind a swirl of questions. She had seen countless cases in her career, but this one felt different. This was something she had never encountered before. Twins, identical in every way, raised together, yet their DNA didn't match. The more she thought about it, the more unsettling it became. Who were these people? What kind of secret were they hiding? And why did it feel like they were standing on the edge of something much larger than a simple genetic anomaly? "Dr. Ellis," Turner said, her voice steady but filled with the weight of the unknown, "we need to get to the bottom of this. We can't leave any stone unturned. Whatever this is, it's not just a mistake or a mix-up. There's something far deeper here." Dr. Claire Ellis nodded in agreement, her face pale as she sifted through the papers on her desk, trying to find something, anything, that could explain what she had seen. The test results were clear, yet so incomprehensible. It was like looking at a puzzle with pieces that didn't fit, no matter how hard you tried to make them work. "I've already contacted the adoption agency," Dr. Ellis said, running her fingers through her hair. "But they're being tight-lipped. They say the records are confidential, and they'll need a court order to release anything." Turner's lips pressed into a thin line. She knew the bureaucracy all too well. But if there was one thing she had learned in her career, it was that when the system wouldn't cooperate, you had to go around it. "Get the ball rolling on that court order," she said. "But in the meantime, we'll have to dig deeper. There's got to be someone who knows something, someone who has seen these twins before." Dr. Ellis raised an eyebrow. "You think someone will talk?" "I don't know," Turner replied, "but the truth has a way of coming out, even when people try to hide it. We just need to keep pushing." The two women shared a brief, knowing glance, before they turned toward the examination room. Inside, the twins sat in uneasy silence, still processing the revelation that their genetic makeup didn't match. They had been through a lot in their lives, but this was something they couldn't have prepared for. As Dr. Ellis and Detective Turner entered the room, the twins looked up, their faces a mix of confusion and fear. "What's going to happen now?" the young man, Mark, asked, his voice strained. "How is this even possible? We've been told our whole lives that we were adopted together, that we were siblings." Dr. Ellis sat across from them, her gaze soft yet filled with the seriousness of the situation. "We don't know yet, Mark. But we're going to find out. We're going to investigate everything, from your adoption to the people involved. And we'll get to the bottom of this." The young woman, Mia, leaned forward, her eyes wide with uncertainty. "What if we're not related at all? What does that mean? Does it change everything about us?" Turner stepped forward, her demeanor firm but kind. "I know this is hard to understand, Mia. But you need to stay strong. We'll get the answers you need, and we'll figure out what this all means. For now, all we can do is keep looking." Mark and Mia exchanged another glance, their expressions unreadable. It was clear that they were both struggling to make sense of the situation. The idea that their entire identity might be built on a lie was overwhelming. But in the face of the unknown, they had no choice but to trust the professionals around them. "We'll need to start by talking to the people who were involved in your adoption," Turner said, standing up and motioning for Dr. Ellis to follow her out. "We need to know if anyone has seen these twins before, or if there's something in the adoption records that could give us more information." As the two women walked down the hallway, the weight of the task ahead of them settled heavily on their shoulders. The truth wasn't going to come easy. It never did. But they couldn't stop now, not when they were this close to uncovering something that could shatter everything these twins thought they knew about themselves. Later that evening, Turner and Dr. Ellis found themselves at a small cafe, huddled together over a laptop as they went through the limited information they had managed to gather. The adoption agency had proved to be less than cooperative, and Turner had taken the matter into her own hands, contacting old colleagues and resources to get access to the necessary records. "I've got something," Turner said suddenly, her eyes narrowing as she scanned a document on the screen. "This is from an investigator who worked on the twins' case years ago. They were brought in for adoption after being found abandoned in an alley. No one ever came forward to claim them, and they were placed in the system together, as a pair." Dr. Ellis leaned over to take a closer look. "Found abandoned? That's strange. Why would someone abandon twins like that? I don't know, Turner muttered, clicking through more pages. But it gets weirder. The investigator notes mention that they were found with no identification, no birth certificates, nothing. Just two babies, left alone, with no trace of who their parents were. The case went cold, and they were eventually put up for adoption. Dr. Ellis felt a chill run down her spine. That doesn't make sense. How could two babies, twins, be abandoned like that, with no record of who they were? It's not adding up, Turner agreed. And it's not the only strange thing. According to this investigator, there were a few other children found around the same time in that same neighborhood. But none of them were placed for adoption. The twins were the only ones who ended up in the system. Dr. Ellis sat back, her mind racing. Could it be possible that they were part of some sort of experiment? Maybe something illegal? Some twisted research? Turner didn't answer right away. She just stared at the screen, lost in thought. I don't know. But this smells like a cover-up. And I'm going to find out who's behind it. They sat in silence for a long moment, both of them trying to process the enormity of what they were uncovering. The idea that these twins had been deliberately kept in the dark about their true origins was horrifying. But the thought that someone had purposely erased their history, that their lives had been manipulated from the very start, was even more disturbing. Let's go to the alley, Turner finally said, breaking the silence. We need to see where they were found. Maybe it will give us some clues. The next morning, Turner and Dr. Ellis drove to the alley where Mark and Mia had been abandoned so many years ago. The area had since been gentrified, with new buildings and businesses sprouting up in the once gritty neighborhood. But the alley still existed, a forgotten corner of the city that few paid attention to. As they walked through the narrow path, Dr. Ellis couldn't shake the sense of unease that settled over her. There was something about this place, something about the way it felt, that made her skin crawl. She could almost imagine the scene as it had been all those years ago, two small infants, left alone, abandoned with no one to care for them. I don't like this, Dr. Ellis muttered, looking around. It feels wrong. Yeah, Turner agreed. But we have to keep going. We're not leaving until we have answers. They spent hours walking through the alley, talking to locals who had been around during the time the twins had been found. Most didn't remember anything specific, and those who did only had vague recollections. But there was one woman who caught their attention, an elderly woman named Mrs. Hollingsworth, who had lived in the neighborhood for over 40 years. They were left in the alley all right, Mrs. Hollingsworth said, her voice shaky with age but sharp with clarity. Twins, no older than a few months. But there was something strange about them, something that didn't sit right. I never told anyone, but I saw someone watching over them that night. A man. Tall, with dark hair. He didn't look like he belonged here. I remember him because he gave me a look, like he was warning me not to get involved. Did you see his face? Turner asked eagerly. Mrs. Hollingsworth shook her head slowly. No. But I never forgot those eyes. They were cold, like he knew something I didn't. Lead she could think of, but it was slow going. The more they tried to learn about the man in the alley, the more the case seemed to vanish into thin air. In the meantime, Mark and Mia had been trying to process everything they had learned. Their entire world had been turned upside down in a matter of days. What they had thought to be a normal, happy childhood was now overshadowed by the overwhelming suspicion that they were part of something much bigger than they could ever imagine. What if they weren't just abandoned? Mia had asked one evening as they sat in their living room, staring at the walls in silence. What if this was all planned? What if we weren't meant to be raised as a family at all? Mark looked at his sister, his face pale. You think they used us for something? Like experiments? Mia shook her head, not sure what she believed anymore. I don't know. But there's something off about all of this. Something isn't right. I can feel it. They both sat in the heavy silence that followed, the weight of their uncertainty pressing down on them. Everything they had thought to be true, everything they had built their lives on, was now a lie. And they didn't know who to trust. A week later, Turner received a breakthrough. A former police officer who had worked in the area where the twins had been abandoned years ago came forward with new information. The officer, now retired, had been investigating a string of odd disappearances in the neighborhood around the same time Mark and Mia were found. He had long since dismissed the case as a series of isolated incidents, but in light of the recent developments, he was willing to revisit the case. I remember that night, the retired officer, Jim Hargrove, said. It wasn't just the twins. We found a few others around the same time. A little girl, a baby boy, all abandoned, just like the twins. But what stood out to me wasn't the babies, it was the fact that they were all left in places that felt chosen. Chosen? Turner asked, confused. What do you mean by that? Hargrove paused, looking down at the ground as though he were trying to piece together memories from a distant time. I've been around a long time. I've seen a lot of things. But those babies, they were left in areas that had been carefully selected. Not random places, places where no one would see you. No one would ask questions. Turner felt a chill creep up her spine. Are you saying this was deliberate? Hargrove nodded grimly. Exactly. I didn't make the connection back then, but looking at it now, yeah, someone was behind it. And I'm willing to bet they weren't just trying to ditch these kids. They were trying to hide something. Turner leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. What do you think it was? The retired officer took a long, heavy breath. I don't know. But I remember something else. A man. A tall, dark-haired man who showed up at the scene the night the twins were found. He didn't talk to anyone, didn't try to help with the babies. He just stood there, watching. I saw him from a distance. It was too late for him to be involved in the investigation, but he was there, watching from the shadows. I couldn't tell if he was worried or if he was waiting for someone else. Turner's heart raced. Do you remember what he looked like? Anything that could help us identify him? Hargrove shook his head. It was too dark. All I could see were his eyes. Cold, like he was sizing me up. And then he disappeared. This was the lead they had been waiting for. Turner couldn't ignore the weight of the officer's words. It was starting to feel like this case wasn't just about two lost twins. It was about something much bigger, something that involved powerful people, secrets, and an agenda that was years in the making. Do you have any other information from your investigation? Turner asked, already pulling out her notebook. Hargrove hesitated, then sighed. I remember the name of the adoption agency. It wasn't one of the big ones. It was a smaller, private agency. I remember it because it was one of the only places in the area that would take in cases like these. The adoption records weren't clear, and the paperwork was minimal. But there was one thing that stood out. What was that? Turner asked, leaning in. Hargrove's eyes narrowed. The name of the person who arranged the adoption. I've never heard of him, but his name was on all the paperwork. A man named Richard Faulkner. Back at the police station, Turner's team was already working on tracking down Richard Faulkner. It didn't take long to discover that Faulkner had been involved in several similar cases over the years, cases that had never made the news, cases that had disappeared into obscurity. It was clear that he was connected to something much larger than just the twins' adoption. Let's get a team together, Turner said, standing up. We need to bring him in for questioning. Whatever he's hiding, we're going to find it. Meanwhile, Mia and Mark were struggling to hold it together. Every day brought new discoveries, new questions, but no answers. Their sense of identity was crumbling, and they were forced to confront the possibility that their entire lives had been manipulated. They knew they couldn't go on like this. They had to know the truth, no matter how dark it might be. That night, as they sat together in their apartment, the doorbell rang. It was a sharp, sudden sound that sent both of them to their feet. They looked at each other, fear creeping up their spines. Who could it be at this hour? Mia cautiously approached the door and opened it. To her shock, standing in front of her was a man she had never seen before. Tall, dark hair, and a look in his eyes that was both familiar and terrifying. The man didn't say a word. Instead, he handed Mia a letter. It was thick, sealed with wax. She took it hesitantly and opened it, her hands trembling. The letter simply read, "You're closer than you think. Be careful. Faulkner's watching." Mia's hands trembled as she held the mysterious letter in her grasp. The wax seal, still intact, seemed almost deliberate in its simplicity, as though it were meant to send a message. Someone knew something, and they wanted her to know it. The letter had arrived just as the fear she and Mark had been carrying for days threatened to swallow them whole. Faulkner's watching. The words echoed in her mind, the weight of them sinking deep into her chest. She glanced over at Mark, who stood frozen in the hallway, his face pale, eyes wide. He had heard the doorbell and had rushed to her side, but now he stood there, unsure of what to do next. Who is this from?" Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper. "And why now?" Mia shook her head, not knowing how to respond. "I don't know, Mark. But it's clear someone doesn't want us to keep digging. Faulkner, this man, he's connected to all of this." Mark's gaze shifted to the letter again, his brow furrowed. "But who's trying to warn us? Why now, after all these years?" Mia could only stare at the letter in her hands, trying to make sense of the few cryptic lines written on the paper. "Be careful. Faulkner's watching." The words seemed like an ominous reminder that someone out there knew more about their past than they did. And that person, or people, had been watching them all along. They had already uncovered so many strange connections and unsettling truths about their past. First, the bizarre DNA test results that revealed they weren't biological twins, and then the haunting mystery of their abandonment. Now, they were faced with a new revelation. Richard Faulkner, the man behind their adoption, was part of a much larger web of deceit. But what exactly was his role? And what did the letter mean by Faulkner's watching? The silence in the room stretched between them, thick and suffocating, before Mark finally broke it. "We have to figure out who sent this. Whoever they are, they're trying to help us." Mia nodded, determination replacing the fear in her eyes. "We need answers. We can't just sit here and wait. We're being followed, Mark. We need to find out everything we can about Faulkner and what happened before we were adopted." But even as she spoke the words, Mia felt the weight of the unknown pressing down on her. They had no idea where to begin, no real answers, only pieces of a puzzle that didn't seem to fit. Still, they couldn't afford to stop now. Too much had been uncovered, and the danger was growing. Meanwhile, Detective Turner had been working tirelessly to uncover the truth about Richard Faulkner. With every lead that came in, it became clear that Faulkner was not a simple man. He had ties to multiple adoption agencies, many of them privately operated, and all of them had questionable records. He had slipped through the cracks of every investigation, always managing to avoid the spotlight. But now, with the twins on the brink of discovering the truth, Turner was beginning to connect the dots. Faulkner wasn't just involved in shady adoption practices, he was involved in something far more sinister. After weeks of research, Turner had finally tracked down a former employee of one of Faulkner's agencies. The woman, now in her mid-50s, had been part of the team that oversaw the twins' adoption many years ago. Her name was Ann Dalton, and she had left the agency under mysterious circumstances. She was reluctant to speak at first, but after some persuasion, she agreed to meet with Turner in a quiet cafe away from prying eyes. "I don't know how to say this, detective," Anne said, nervously stirring her coffee as she avoided Turner's gaze. "But I don't think Richard Faulkner was ever just running an adoption agency. He was involved in something far bigger, something that I think the twins were unknowingly caught in." Turner leaned forward, intrigued. "What do you mean? What was Faulkner really doing?" And hesitated before answering. "I've been running from my past for years, and I'm scared to even talk about it. But I can't keep silent any longer. You need to know the truth. Faulkner wasn't just handling adoptions, he was part of a larger organization that was trafficking children. I don't know all the details, but I saw things that made my skin crawl. Things I can't unsee." Turner's stomach twisted at the revelation. "Are you saying the twins were trafficked?" And nodded slowly. "I'm not sure. But I know that they were taken in by people who had no intention of giving them a normal life. They were part of a plan, detective. A plan that involved more than just the children. They wanted to control the parents, the families, everything. I'm sorry, but I don't have all the answers. I just know that Faulkner is dangerous. And if you're looking for him, you're getting too close to something dark." Turner was stunned, her mind racing as Anne's words sank in. "I need to know more. Please, anything you can tell me." And looked around nervously before leaning in closer. "You need to start looking into the people Faulkner was working with. He wasn't alone. There were others, people with money, influence, power. They're still out there. And they'll stop at nothing to protect their secrets." Back at Mark and Mia's apartment, the tension was mounting. The letter had only raised more questions than answers, and now they had to figure out their next move. Mia stared out the window, her mind spinning with the possibilities. Who was behind the letter? Why were they warning them about Faulkner? What did it all mean? Mark sat across from her, his gaze fixed on the envelope. "We need to find out more about him. This guy, Faulkner. Who he is. What he did." "I agree," Mia replied, her voice steady despite the fear creeping up inside her. "But we can't just walk into this blindly. There's something we're missing. Something important." The two of them spent the next several hours researching everything they could find about Richard Faulkner. It wasn't much, but they pieced together bits and pieces of information, old court cases, adoption records, and government reports that had been buried under layers of bureaucracy. But still, they weren't getting the answers they needed. It was as if Faulkner had deliberately erased his past, making it nearly impossible to find any real trace of him. Mia felt a pang of frustration. They were so close, yet so far away. As night fell, Mia sat back in her chair, exhausted. "We need to talk to someone who knows him. Someone who's worked with him, or against him. We need to know what he's really capable of." Mark nodded. "I know. But who? Where do we even begin?" Mia's mind raced, a sudden thought flashing through her. She grabbed her phone and typed out a message before sending it. "I think I might know someone who can help. Someone who's been trying to bring Faulkner down for years." Mark looked at her, confused. "Who?" Mia's eyes met his, determination in her voice. "A journalist. Someone who's been investigating this for a long time." The next morning, Mia received a reply from the journalist. The message was short but to the point. "Meet me at the old warehouse on 5th and Maple tonight at 9 p.m. Bring Mark. Don't trust anyone else." Mia stared at the message, her heart racing. This was the break they had been waiting for. It was risky, but they didn't have any other choice. They were running out of time. "Get ready, Mark," Mia said, her voice calm but urgent. "Tonight, we find the answers." The night was thick with anticipation as Mia and Mark drove through the empty streets. The hum of the engine seemed louder than usual, and Mia's fingers gripped the wheel tighter with each mile. Every corner they turned brought them closer to the old warehouse on 5th and Maple, a place they had never been to before but somehow felt drawn to. The journalist's message had been clear: no one else could be trusted. As the city lights began to fade into the distance and the darkness of the outskirts closed in around them, Mia felt the weight of the night pressing down on her chest. The warehouse loomed ahead, a dilapidated structure surrounded by high fences and broken-down equipment. It looked abandoned, the kind of place that no one would dare venture near after dark. Yet, Mia knew that tonight, the secrets hidden within its walls would be revealed. Mark shifted uneasily in the passenger seat, his eyes scanning their surroundings. "Do you really think this journalist knows something? What if it's a trap?" Mia glanced at him, her expression firm but uncertain. "I don't know. But we don't have a choice. We've come too far to back down now." They parked a few blocks away from the warehouse, the last stretch of their journey feeling like the longest. Mia checked her phone one last time. The message was brief, but it carried the weight of urgency. "Meet me at the old warehouse on 5th and Maple tonight at 9 p.m. Don't trust anyone else." The minute hand on her watch ticked closer to 9 o'clock, and with it, the sense of danger in the air became palpable. They stepped out of the car, their footsteps muffled by the gravel beneath them. The night was unusually quiet, too quiet. It felt as if the world had held its breath, waiting for something to happen. "I've got a bad feeling about this," Mark muttered as they walked toward the entrance of the warehouse. His hand rested on the gun in his jacket, a reminder that they were not walking into this unarmed. "We'll be fine," Mia replied, though the uncertainty in her voice mirrored his own. "We just have to stay calm. We're looking for answers. And if someone is trying to warn us, we need to know why." They reached the warehouse's front door, which was slightly ajar, just as the journalist's message had said it would be. The dim light from a flickering street lamp outside cast long shadows across the cracked concrete. Mia hesitated for a moment, listening for any sounds from within, but there was nothing. She pushed the door open slowly, and the creak of the hinges broke the silence like a warning. The interior of the warehouse was just as abandoned as it appeared from the outside. Old, rusted machinery lined the walls, and dust hung thick in the air. But there, in the center of the room, stood a figure, their back turned to them. Mia's heart skipped a beat. Could it be the journalist? "Hello?" she called out, her voice low, cautious. She didn't want to startle them, but she needed to know if they were in the right place. The figure turned, revealing a woman in her mid-30s with short, dark hair. She wore a leather jacket and a pair of black boots, a far cry from the expected professional attire Mia had imagined. Her eyes were sharp, assessing the twins in an instant. "I'm glad you came," the woman said, her voice steady, but there was an edge of urgency in her tone. "I wasn't sure you'd show up." Mia stepped forward, not entirely sure who she was dealing with. "Are you the journalist? The one who sent the message?" The woman nodded, her eyes flicking nervously to the shadows beyond them. "Yes. My name's Clara Jensen. I've been investigating Faulkner for years. I'm the one who's been trying to expose what he's really doing. But I'm not the only one who knows about you too." Mia and Mark exchanged a quick glance, both of them sensing that the meeting was taking a dangerous turn. "What do you mean?" Mark asked, stepping closer to Mia. "What do you know about us?" Clara took a deep breath, as though steeling herself for what she was about to reveal. "Everything," she said quietly. "I know about the DNA test. I know about your parents. And I know about Faulkner." Mia felt a chill run down her spine. "How do you know all of this?" Clara glanced around again, making sure they were still alone. "I've been digging into Faulkner for years. At first, it was just a hunch, something wasn't right about him. But the more I looked into his past, the more I realized how deep the corruption went. Faulkner wasn't just involved in child trafficking, he was part of something bigger, something that started long before you two were born. Mia's breath caught in her throat. What do you mean? What started before we were born? Clara stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. It's not just the adoption network. Faulkner's ties go all the way back to a secret government operation. They were working with powerful people, people who wanted to control certain populations for their own purposes. The children they took, including you, weren't just placed in random homes. They were chosen for a reason. Your DNA, it's unique. There's something about it that they wanted. Something they still want. Mark's eyes narrowed. Are you saying that we're part of some kind of experiment? Clara nodded. Not just any experiment. The children they selected weren't ordinary. They were meant to be part of something much larger. Something that would shape the future. But Faulkner was just a small piece of the puzzle. There are others, people who still want to keep this quiet. Mia felt her legs shake beneath her. So, what does this have to do with us? What does Faulkner want with us? Clara took another step forward, her expression grim. Faulkner was assigned to oversee your adoption because your parents were key players in this operation. They knew what was happening, but they were forced to give you up. They had no choice. You two were never meant to be raised together. But something happened, and now, it's all coming to the surface. Mia's head spun with confusion. My parents? What do you mean? How is any of this possible? Clara glanced behind them again, her voice dropping lower. I'm not the only one looking for answers. Faulkner has been hiding in plain sight for years, and now, people are starting to ask the same questions you're asking. If you want to survive this, you have to understand that you're not just fighting for the truth about your past, you're fighting for your lives. Meanwhile, Detective Turner was back at the precinct, staring at her desk littered with files. The conversation with Ann Dalton had rattled her more than she had let on. It wasn't just about the twins anymore, it was about something much darker. The pieces were finally starting to fall into place, and Faulkner's name was connected to more than just one criminal activity. He was involved in a network that extended far beyond anything she had imagined. And now, the twins were at the center of it all. She ran her fingers through her hair, frustration mounting. Every lead she had uncovered pointed to the same conclusion: the adoption network wasn't just about finding homes for children, it was a cover-up for something much larger. But what was the endgame? Back at the warehouse, Mia could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Clara's words had left them with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear: they were in deeper than they had ever imagined. They weren't just dealing with a corrupt adoption agency, they were up against a powerful force that had been operating in the shadows for decades. We need to get out of here, Mark said, his voice low but urgent. This isn't safe. We need to figure out what to do next. But as they turned to leave, a noise echoed from the back of the warehouse, footsteps, too deliberate to be random. Clara's eyes widened in alarm. Get down. Before they could react, the lights went out, plunging the warehouse into darkness. The warehouse descended into a haunting silence, the kind that pressed against your chest and made every breath feel like an intrusion. Mia's heart pounded in her ears, her breath shallow and rapid. Mark's hand found hers, his grip tight, as if anchoring them both to the present moment. The sudden darkness was disorienting, but Mia could sense the urgency in the air, a quiet tension that told her something dangerous was about to unfold. What's happening? Mark whispered, his voice barely audible in the pitch black. I don't know, Mia muttered, straining her eyes to adjust to the gloom. But it was useless. The darkness swallowed everything. The cold, damp air of the warehouse felt oppressive now, heavier than before. It felt as though the space around them was alive, watching, waiting. In the eerie quiet, a sound echoed, footsteps, deliberate and slow. It was a sound they hadn't heard until just moments ago, but it was enough to send a chill down Mia's spine. Whoever was out there knew they were here. The sense of being hunted was overwhelming. "Stay close," Mia instructed, her voice a low whisper. Mark didn't need to be told twice. His hand squeezed hers as they pressed their backs together, each waiting for the next move. They heard it again, footsteps. Closer this time. The faint creak of a floorboard under pressure. Whoever was out there was moving toward them with purpose. And they weren't alone. Suddenly, a beam of light sliced through the darkness, blinding them for a moment. It was too fast, too sudden, like a flashlight being swung in their direction. But as the light steadied, they saw a figure. A man in a black jacket, his face obscured by shadows, but his eyes shining with something Mia couldn't quite place. He was no ordinary intruder. Clara had been right. They weren't alone, and the stakes were higher than ever. The man stopped a few feet away, his silhouette now visible in the dim light. He didn't speak immediately, but his presence seemed to fill the room, his mere existence commanding attention. Mia's instincts screamed at her to move, but she stood frozen, her eyes locked on the figure in front of them. "You're in the wrong place," the man finally spoke, his voice smooth, cold, and professional. Mia's stomach twisted. She had no idea who this person was, but he clearly knew exactly who they were. "We're just looking for answers," Mia said, trying to keep her voice steady. She had no idea what this man's motives were, but she knew she couldn't show any fear. The man's lips curled into a slight smirk, as though her response was nothing but a trivial diversion. "Answers? You've been digging into the wrong places, Mia. The wrong people." At the mention of her name, Mia felt her blood run cold. How did he know her? "You know who we are?" Mark's voice cut through the tension, his tone sharper now. He wasn't about to back down. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, the flashlight beam still fixed on them. It illuminated his face for just a moment, and that brief glimpse was enough to send a rush of recognition through Mia's mind. It was Faulkner. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Faulkner, the man they'd been searching for, the man who had been at the center of everything, the one who had manipulated their lives from the shadows. She had no idea how or why he was here, but his presence was a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. "You?" Mark growled, his jaw tight with rage. "We've been chasing you for weeks. You've ruined everything." Faulkner didn't flinch at Mark's words. Instead, he let out a slow, almost mocking chuckle. "Chasing me? You've barely scratched the surface, my dear boy. You think you know who I am? What I've been a part of? You don't know anything." Mia's heart raced, a million questions swirling in her mind. What was he talking about? What was this thing he had been a part of? "Why are you doing this?" Mia demanded, her voice shaking with the urgency of the moment. "What do you want with us? Why did I take you?" Faulkner interrupted, his voice growing darker. "You weren't supposed to be part of this. You two were just tools. Pawns in a game that's bigger than anything you could possibly understand." He stepped closer to them now, his eyes gleaming in the faint light. Mia tried to step back, but there was nowhere to go. The walls of the warehouse pressed in on them, closing off any escape. "I didn't want to be part of this," Mia said, her voice trembling despite her efforts to stay strong. "I never asked for this." "Oh, but you were always meant to be part of it," Faulkner replied, his voice now low and menacing. "You're not just children in an adoption network. You were specifically chosen for this. Your entire existence has been orchestrated. You were bred for this." The words hit Mia like a slap to the face. She felt dizzy, her mind struggling to comprehend what he was saying. Bred for this? She didn't understand. What did he mean? Bread for what? Mark asked, his voice filled with confusion and anger. What are you talking about? Faulkner didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took another step toward them, his gaze unflinching. You were part of an experiment, Mark. And you, Mia. From the moment you were born, you were being prepared for something bigger. Something dangerous. And now, you're standing in my way. Mia couldn't breathe. Her mind was racing, her thoughts clouded with disbelief. How could this be possible? How could they have been part of an experiment? What had they been subjected to without knowing? Before she could process anything further, a voice from behind them called out. Faulkner, stop. Clara emerged from the shadows, her face stern, her body rigid with tension. Faulkner turned toward her, his expression unreadable. You should have stayed away, Faulkner said, his voice low and threatening. This doesn't concern you. Clara stood her ground. It does now. You've taken things too far. These children. They're not children, Clara, Faulkner snapped, his eyes narrowing. They're weapons. And now, you're in my way. I can't let you ruin everything I've worked for. Mia's mind was reeling. Weapons? They were being used as weapons? How had it all come to this? What had they been a part of? Clara's eyes flicked toward Mia and Mark, and for a moment, there was a glimmer of something like pity in her gaze. You don't know the whole truth yet. But you will. Faulkner's expression hardened. Enough. In a flash, he moved toward them, the coldness in his eyes intensifying. But before he could reach them, the sound of sirens broke through the tension like a thunderclap. The distant wail of police vehicles grew louder with every passing second. Faulkner froze, his eyes darting toward the door, his face twisting with fury. No, he hissed. You've made a mistake. But it was too late. The warehouse door burst open, and Detective Turner, followed by a team of officers, stormed inside, guns raised. Faulkner, don't move. Detective Turner shouted, her voice sharp and commanding. Mia's heart leapt in her chest. They had made it. They were here. But the battle wasn't over yet. Faulkner wasn't the kind of man to go down easily. He had too much to lose.